From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health. And now here is our host and producer, Hilda Labrada Gore.
Hey, Hilda here. Many of us consider regenerative agriculture as the best system to heal the planet and regenerate the soil. Obviously, meet a farmer who thinks the label of regenerative agriculture and its approach is insufficient. This is episode 430, and our guest today is Daniel Griffith. Daniel is an author, the co-manager of Timshel Wildland in Virginia, and the president of the Robinia Institute. He works with Alan Savory, and his team is committed to regenerative agriculture to a point. He would even go so far to say it saved his life. Nevertheless, today, Daniel challenges our approach to the land and the label that we often use. He suggests that we need to wild the regenerative movement. He reminds us that we ourselves are the earth and the soil in many respects, and that rediscovering our roots reframes the conversation about farming and our own relationship to the land. He also dives into where to start to make a difference in healing that relationship. Along the way, Daniel shares insights about his own health story and how he went from broken, and I mean really broken, to restoring his natural balance and health. Before we dive into the conversation, I want to invite you to connect with your local farms and to buy food from them. It's good for your health, the local economy, and of course, it's a way to ensure stable food for the future. If you're not sure where to find real food, find your local chapter leader. The Weston A. Price Foundation has a system of volunteer chapter leaders around the U.S. and the world, and their only job is to help people find real food. So go to westonaprice.org and click on the Find Food/Local Chapters tab and click on the local chapter list to see who is near you to help you out. I'll put a link in the show description to make this super easy for you. And a side note, this is how I first got involved with the Weston A. Price Foundation. I was just looking for raw milk for my family, and one thing led to the next. This is Hilda Labrada Gore, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Daniel.
Hi, Hilda. It is just an absolute joy and blessing to be with you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear some of your stories. I got to hear some at the Force of Nature event that we were at together, and I just was like, wow. Well, you're reminiscent to me of Wendell Berry. Just kind of got that poetic heart and also that desire to connect with nature, which is so lovely.
I appreciate that. I hope to live up to about 10% of what Berry has accomplished. So it's a deep compliment.
I know, truly. He's up there. I wanted to start with asking you about what brought you to the regenerative agriculture space? What brought you back to the earth and understanding your place in it? I know you were outdoorsy as a kid, you were active, but then there was kind of a health crisis. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's a really great starting point. I think a lot of these conversations that I'm itching and you're itching to have kind of stem from my upbringing and, like you were saying, this pivotal moment in my health journey. It happened my junior year. I keep wanting to say sophomore, my junior year in high school. But before we get there, just a quick unpeeling of the previous years. My family, we were all homeschooled. I have a son of 3 other siblings, one of 4. All of us were homeschooled on 30 acres just outside of Cleveland, Ohio. It was like, as I remember it, the last harbor of acreage in like the last periphery of the suburbs of Cleveland. So all of our neighbors had half an acre, quarter acre, eighth an acre. Maybe they had 1 acre or something. And we had this 30-acre chunk there. It was this last remnant of a rural community. When I graduated high school, I remember we built this photo album, and almost every picture in the photo album up until like high school, I was pretty much naked, pretty much covered in dirt. The older I got, I guess I was a little more clad in underwear. But there's just a totally different childhood from a lot of the community in which I was raised. One of the highlights I love to touch on in this moment is as we were homeschooled, this whole like unschooling sort of movement maybe was just being birthed or just coming into popularity. I don't think my family even knew of it. My mom was just entirely focused. We used to have most of our school day was just like play outside time. It was just go play outside and we would read books. And the thing that we did the most of, which now looking back, I think this is just absolutely pivotal to where I am in my life today. But she would have these things called tellbacks, where no matter if you read a book or you had an experience or you went out and you talked to a butterfly or something, you can come home and she would ask, hey, what happened? Like, tell me back this thing that you just lived. And like I said, sometimes you were a participant in a story floating down the Mississippi River with Huck Finn, or Maybe it was a butterfly or a toad or something, or some make-believe character that you played outside with your siblings all day long covered in dirt. But it was this moment of like connection internally. Like, how did you perceive the event? Connect with yourself and tell me the story. And at the time, I'm just a child. I had no bearing for that powerful reality. But now as we jump forward, I was a very good high school athletics, football player, Division I scholarships, wrestler, national champion type stuff. In my junior year in high school, I was jogging around the football field. In high school athletics, especially football, you have these things called two-a-days. It's the beginning of the football season. You do 2 practices a day. Typically, it's very early in the morning, and it's kind of your entrance into the varsity football season. And it was the first practice of the first practice, because you have 2 practices a day, and it was the first moment of the first practice. It was like the entry moment to my junior year, which if you have any interest in playing college athletics, like this is your moment. If you don't shine in this exact moment, you don't fulfill those scholarships. You get scholarships as a sophomore. You fulfill the purpose. The idea there is your junior year, and then you just kind of play around your senior year. That's the idea of athletic scholarships. So this was the moment, and I'll never forget, we were running around the football field as a little warm-up, and I just collapsed. Just went from this unbelievably perfect health, no pain, no anything, and I just collapsed. At the time, the athletic directors with the Ohio State Medical Center had no understanding of what happened. We thought it was a hip flexor strain. We just thought my body was just X, Y, and Z. We were stretching and going to therapy, and what we didn't know is I had this strange degenerative type genetic disease where all of the femoral heads or I forget the bone in your arms, but it's that ball and socket joint. Mm-hmm. There's a ball inside of a socket, and that's how your arms and legs can move as they so do. I was born with like squares and sockets. Oh. And so the head of my femur was basically a square, and the head of my whatever arm bone was like a square. And so my whole life I had been a ticking time bomb physically. My labrum was deteriorating. I had no rotator cuffs. I was scraping my pelvis bones with my head of the femur bone. And it was just all of this deconstruction. And the second we started looking into that, we noticed that I had a lot of really, really deepened autoimmune diseases. Anyway, skipping a bunch of the details, stopped athletics at that point, never pursued college athletics. I lived about 7 or 8 years, just in immense medical trauma. Had all my limbs taken off, had to relearn how to walk again. I spent a year at the Cleveland Clinic where I would lay on a table and the doctor, the physical therapist would just touch a muscle. Maybe it was my quad muscle. And I would have to focus for an hour on just flexing that. So I was building these neural pathways all over again. It was crazy.
Oh my goodness, this is crazy indeed. I mean, I thought you were speaking metaphorically before we started rolling and you said, yeah, I had my limbs taken off. You literally had your limbs taken off. It sounds horrific and shocking considering your near idyllic childhood. When you were talking about being outside in the sun and half naked, I'm like, that sounds amazing.
Right.
And somehow you had these issues that suddenly appeared. So yeah, let's fast forward to now. Like, I don't mean to fast forward past it all, but like you said, it's very involved.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about the recovery process. What helped you?
Well, everything changed. So we would go through periods of my life where I would lose 80 to 90 pounds in a singular month, and then I would work for 2 months to gain it back. And we were just in this unbelievable rotation of degeneration and then a little bit of health and then degeneration. And one spring, maybe 10 years ago, I was sitting on the back porch of my childhood home, married to my wife by this time. She was away working full time. And a good friend of mine, my godfather, actually, the only person in my life that was an agriculturalist, a farmer. He was a local cattle rancher, grass-fed and finished type cattle rancher. And he had given me Joel Salatin's book, Folks, This Ain't Normal. I was sitting on the back porch, really unable to do anything else, and I was reading it. And I'll never forget, my mom walked out of the back porch, sliding glass door, if you will, and she looked at me, and I'll never forget her face. She had this like smirk, as if she was about to say something really interesting and funny, but also like there was pain, like there was grief and joy, pain and happiness. It was all together in one. I'll just never forget this moment. And she says, Daniel, we've tried everything. And I was like, oh, hi, Mom. Hello to you too. And she goes, no, we've tried everything. And we have. And I'll skip those details, of course, but we had literally tried everything. Eastern medicine, Western medicine, acupuncture, taking my limbs off, just everything in between. And then she said, the only thing we haven't tried is chickens. And it's funny now looking back. I think her point was this whole time we had been very passive in our understanding of health. We had been seeking these gurus and shamans and medical directors and everybody in between. And what she was saying is, what if we become active participants in our natural world? And what if we just started raising chickens? We knew nothing of Joel. We knew nothing of polyface. We knew nothing of poultry. We knew nothing of pastured poultry or free range or the difference between a chicken tractor and a free range system. We knew none of these things.
Wow.
But that day we bought 100 chickens and it was a turning point, an absolute turning point in my life. My wife and I, we joke, we're full-time farmers. We have been for about a decade now. And we always joke that it was always my decision to get into farming because she got home that night and said, hey, Morgan, we're farming. And to her unbelievable credit, she just said yes. And she's fallen in love since. But I think the key with this story is this is really the turning point of our lives. We started participating, right? Not just receiving health. We were an active member. We had active membership within this world of health. But then we started actually eating local. And as we started eating local, we started to fall in love with the local farmers producing the local food. And as we started to fall in love with the local farmers producing local food, we started to volunteer at those local farms. And then we started to fall in love with farming. And then 10 years later, we're running a 400-acre farm here in Central Virginia, raising cattle and sheep and goats and orchards and pigs and everything else.
So, Daniel, that's a beautiful story. And I think yours does mirror many people's, right? It's a journey of gradual discovery and more integration from a certain way of living and a whole new shift. And yet, I want to know from you, when did you become disenchanted with the terminology that we're using today of like regenerative agriculture? Because that's the kind of farming you were describing that obviously Joel exposed you to and that is around you now. When did you realize something's limiting about this label or maybe our whole approach?
Yeah, brilliant question. Let's start here. So I think you, myself, maybe the sum totality of all Weston A. Price podcast listeners, I think we can all agree and start at this underlying foundation that monocultures are a nutritionally impoverished environment, right? And as life participates in those monocultures, it also becomes nutritionally impoverished. I think we can accept that just uniform tenet.
Definitely.
Let other episodes bring the science. For now, let's just accept it.
Yes.
And I think where our challenge begins is this idea of maximizing production. So the idea of a monoculture environment is that production is maximized inputs, soils, local communities, social structures, doesn't matter. Let's just maximize production. And when we maximize production for national or international distribution or trade, it's directly proportional, therefore, then to the decrease of nutritional availability of the local landscape. So let me say that again. We maximize production in these nutritionally deficient landscapes. We then export that production, those quote unquote nourishment or nutrients, calories, let's call them. And we're not just impoverishing those who eat those food items, but we're impoverishing the landscape in which they are grown. And that landscape is not just physical, it's not just ecological, it's social and everything else. And so my point is monocultures have, in theory of soil health and in view of social structures, a natural legacy of poverty that follows, or I should say, works within this idea of food production, of food distribution, of food sovereignty, etc. And I say those things to say this: long has this regenerative movement, which I entered about 10 years ago, postulated, which then turned from a postulate and a scientific inquiry over to something that I think is more or less universally acknowledged, that with a better food system, with a better way of growing that food, with better practices and paradigms and views and visions, we can actually regenerate the soil. We don't have to destroy the soil when we farm. We can actually heal the human body with good, real, nutrient-dense food. Those are things that are all possible. However, it is also possible to do things that look similar to this while they are still a monoculture. They are still a monoculture. And what I mean by that is this. If we just look at the individuals like the scientists, like Stefan von Willett, Fred Provenza, Dan Kittredge of the Biological Food Association, these are all scientists, brilliant minds that are right now leading a scientific inquiry on this idea of nutrient density in food. But what their science is associating is that micronutrients have microprocesses that are relative to place. Okay, and so we have this idea of place. And I think micronutrients via these microprocesses, and by the way, Fred Provenza, Dan Kittredge, I haven't talked to Stefan von Willett as much, but we all agree that the idea of place is as important to the production of nutrient-rich and nutrient-dense foods as any other factor, right? So for instance, let's go over a little bit of ecology. So the sun shines and plants photosynthesize, right? We've learned this in biology class, or maybe we know something about the soil food web. So the sun shines and plants photosynthesize. And via that photosynthesis and through this thing that we call the hydrologic cycle, which is the water cycle, let's use a more simplistic word. So through the water cycle, minerals cycle, nutrients cycle. The plants send down roots. They trade carbon for other plant-available nutrients to bacteria and fungi. Fungi swim around. They're eaten by predatory nematodes. This is that soil food web, the gut of Mother Earth, if you will. And this is a really important cycle. But as this cycle takes place from solar energy, let's say, to beef production, because now the cows eat that herbaceous material, that grass, as it cycles from the sun to the cow, we have the cycling of nutrients from the soil to the plant matter to the cow, back through manure, perhaps, back to the soil surface for regrowth. The idea of regeneration One is the opposite of a monoculture, right? We need many plants. We need many types of bacteria. We need many fungi communities. We need nematodes, predatory nematodes, and non-predatory nematodes. We have a great microbiota all around us. So diversity is this opposite idea for monocultures. But number two, we have to start to view this idea as located by place. If we were to grow nutrients in place A, let's call that this place, and we export those nutrients to place B, let's call that place, right? We are growing and taking the nutrients from here, moving it to there, and we have degenerated, right, place A to, quote, regenerate place B. And so where we come at this and we start our questioning is if the science and rationality tell us that micronutrients or microprocesses produced by place for the healing of that place, then if we can't start to build a regenerative revolution or a regenerative system that understands its connection to place, we have to revision what regeneration means. But that is also say we have to limit what regeneration means.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this is so fascinating. Two things are coming to mind. One is I remember interviewing Jack Kruse. We haven't published that one yet, but he talks a lot about kind of a biological or evolutionary mismatch when we eat food that is from a different place. So yes. For example, if you eat pineapple north of the equator, it doesn't make sense to our bodies. And in part, it may be having to do with the soil and all the things you just mentioned, these micro activities that we're not aware of. And we just think, no big deal. Okay, we have a small world. I can eat pineapple north of the equator. Yes, I can. But can my body absorb the nutrients when it really is meant to be for a different place? Is that part of what you're saying?
That's exactly right. I'll let him speak to the inner dimensions of the scientific process there. But the idea, as we approach it, I'm not a scientist. I was a mathematics and computer science major in college, and I've become a full-time farmer since. And so I understand what I understand, and I'll leave the other thoughts to the experts. What I focus on is this very simplistic understanding that pick up any book on regenerative agriculture, right? From Greg Judy, from Gabe Brown, to Joel Salatin, to all these other pioneers, Alan Savory, personal mentor of mine. And you pick up any one of those books and absolutely contained within every one of those volumes, verbatim, is the exact phrase, regenerative farmers don't export nutrients. Every one of those leaders are claiming that a regenerative idea cannot be exported from a nutrient perspective. And so the first thing we look at is like in a hayfield, right? If the photosynthesis via the soil to food web, carbon and nutrient exchange process is producing, let's say, nutrient-rich forage or grass, and we cut that forage and we put it over here, we've degenerated that first environment. And so hayfields are much less diverse. Hayfields are much less nutritious. Hayfields require a lot more fertilization. And so when you start to work with the regenerative farm, just for background, my wife and I, we run what's called the Robinia Institute. We're a savory hub here in the Mid-Atlantic with the Savory Institute. We do a lot of consulting. We manage tens and tens and tens of thousands of acres indirectly through these local managers that we have in place. We do a lot of soil work, a lot of diversity work. And it's interesting, just yesterday, we concluded a 5-day ecological monitoring course here in Virginia. And we stood in a hayfield with the students. There was about 5 to 7 of them. And we stood in the hayfield and we said, just take a breath, sit down, start to converse with the natural world, and you will see it is dry, it is decadent, it is degenerating, it is singular, right? You don't sit down in a lush, diversified meadow of 73, 75 to 100 different perennial grass and herbaceous perennials, that is to say, wildflowers and forbs and legumes and trees and sedges and rushes and shrubs, and you're overwhelmed with the community. It's moist, it's wet, it's living, it almost seems to hum and buzz and move and pulsate. And then you go to these environments that have been exported, right? A hayfield, a cornfield, you pick what you can access, and it's the entire opposite reality. And the point in bringing that up is to say this: ecologically, a lack of diversity, right, because of exporting nutrients, if we see that as degenerative, if we then instill this quote unquote regenerative world with the idea of verified regenerative labels slapped onto products that go very far distances, now all of a sudden, even if we remove the understanding of like humans needing nutrient dense, real, raw foods, just remove that concept entirely for the moment. We are destroying the environment to feed other areas, right? That's what we're saying here. We're producing food, removing the minerals from that system, and instead of returning those minerals and nutrients, we're exporting those things elsewhere. So from a regenerative practice and agriculture perspective, that has problems.
Right.
And then you enter in everything else, like I just disqualified the human nutrition and nutrient density, and it intensifies.
Absolutely. And that's one thing I wanted to speak to when I said I had two ideas. One was the conversation with Jack Cruz about light. Actually, he talks a lot about light and how light has given information or nourished the animals and the produce in certain areas. And then we take it somewhere else and it doesn't exactly match up. But the other thought I had was when Dr. Price traveled the world, he found healthy traditional indigenous people groups isolated from modernity, and they were thriving, eating their whole real foods. And he talks about it in his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. But what I'm getting at is they weren't eating the foods from other regions, Daniel. They were eating the foods that were growing right where they were.
Right.
So this is something that's really kind of something that's been overlooked. And I'm so glad you're bringing it to our attention. How regenerative are we, right? How much are we living up to that label? And speaking of labels, I do want to ask you too, you've talked about the need for a wilding of this movement. Tell us what you mean by that.
That's a really good question. First off, you're absolutely right. Price's Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. I'm not saying anything that wasn't covered more expertly in that book, just to be very clear. Right? What I'm talking about is what Vandana Shiva is talking about. It's the idea of localism. That first and foremost, we have to build a system that's not sustainable, it's not regenerative, it's not nutrient-dense or nutrient-rich soil producing nutrient-dense foods, it's localism. Because in localism, we have sustainability, we have regeneration, we have nutrient-rich soils producing nutrient-dense foods. And so echoing Price, echoing Shiva, echoing many other brilliant minds, but how wilding or rewilding comes into the fore, I think it comes down to control. That's how we perceive it. To be very clear, when I discuss rewilding, when I discuss wilding, as we like to call it, to separate it from this modern and conservation-minded approach of rewilding, it's not getting humans out of the landscape. It's not putting fences around these natural systems, and I'm using air quotes for those who can't see, these natural systems, and just saying the eradication of a species, that is the human species, is a positive thing and that nature should just be, because we understand there's no such thing as a natural environment today. It doesn't exist. And by the way, thanks to Charles Mann and many other historical anthropologists and archaeologists and thinkers, what a weird comment it is to say that the world has ever been natural. Of course the world is natural. How could it be anything else, right? And in some sense, humanity, who has been there for many millions of years, we have become ingrained into that system. We are Mother Earth. Mother Earth is us. We don't have relationship. We are the relationship, that is to say. A lot of people today, we talk about harmony. We must live in harmony with Mother Earth. In my opinion, that's inappropriate phraseology. We are Mother Earth. Mother Earth is us.
Coming up, Daniel offers advice on what, in his opinion, is the single most important thing that we can do to impact our health and the local farming movement.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Awfully Good Cooking. Head over to liverloverchallenge.com to sign up for a free masterclass led by Janine Farzan of Awfully Good Cooking. This informative masterclass will teach you how to increase your energy and uplevel your life by learning how to confidently prepare liver and other organ meats that actually taste great. You'll also learn what all the hype is about, how to cook any organ, and mindset hacks to get over doubts or mindset about preparing and eating organ meats. Once again, go to liverloverchallenge.com to sign up for this amazing and free educational masterclass led by Janine Farzan. You won't want to miss it. Oh, and a side note, Janine is a Weston A. Price Foundation chapter leader in Colorado. And a shout out to Optimal Carnivore. Optimal Carnivore sources 100% grass-fed organ meats from New Zealand. They freeze-dry the organs and encapsulate them into convenient bovine gelatin capsules. Their mission is to make it easy to access the most nutrient-dense food on the planet, organ meats, as we just mentioned. Optimal Carnivore's products are 100% grass-fed and grass-finished and free of hormones, pesticides, antibiotics, and GMOs. Our ancestors would have eaten the whole animal, which is why Optimal Carnivore has developed a complex of 9 different organ meats, including beef liver, brain, thymus, heart, kidney, spleen, pancreas, lung, and gallbladder. The grass-fed organ complex is perfect for someone on the go or just trying to develop an appreciation for organ meats. So go to amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and use the code WESTON10 to save 10% on all products. They have their grass-fed organ complex, as I just mentioned, the grass-fed bone marrow, a grass-fed liver, a brain nourish product, and their bone and joint restore. Check them all out at amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and use the code WESTON10 at checkout. This is Hoda Labrada Gore, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Think about the word human, right? Doesn't it have its root from the word humus, which means soil?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's in the Koine Greek and the Latin, right? Human, humus, soil. All of that is intertwined. My family and I, as I mentioned in the Force of Nature, What Good Shall I Do conference speech where we met, my family and I practiced Messianic Judaism, and long have I studied the ancient Hebrew or biblical Hebrew language. And it's interesting that same thing goes back to the early traditions of the Hebrew people, which is that when God creates man, he calls him Ha-Adam. And it's just man, like mankind, like the human species. It's debatable whether or not he meant male or female. It doesn't matter. For that, we're not getting into it. But the human species, man, is Ha-Adam.
Ha-Adam.
And when he creates the earth and he looks at it and he calls it dirt or soil, he calls it Ha-Adamah. So the letters A-H, Aleph He, is put at the end of the idea of man. And it literally is the earth, the man. We are just one step different from each other. And the step of difference is really breath. Right? Aleph He is really this idea of breath. I won't get all into this. We could podcast about the Hebrew language for way too long, but...
Oh, it's fascinating. But I can hear in even the words you're saying, the sound of breath. Ha.
Right?
Yes.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And in Genesis 1:2, or we would call it Bereshit 1:2, the second verse of Genesis or Bereshit, it says, V'choshek al panei techom v'ruach Elohim marachapet al panei chamayim. And what that says, other than just being ridiculously gorgeous, in my opinion, it's a beautiful language.
Yeah.
And what it says is, in this idea of the beginning, the earth was welter and waste in the darkness, and I focus here, and her divine breath hovered over the waters. And so it's so interesting, not just in the creation of the human species, do we see the interplay, the relationship between man and earth, Ha-Adam, Ha-Adamah, but at the beginning of creation, when there is only just these darkness and water, right, that which we all emerge, the idea of water in many different religions, many different modalities of health and thought, we have this thing called this divine breath, right? And it's called Varuach Elohim. I'll end here because, again, I can talk about this for a while, but at the end of creation, that's the beginning of creation, we have this idea of divine breath. And at the end of creation, when God creates Eve, he calls her Chava, which is another unbelievably breathy word, and it means the giver of breath. And so we have this interplay between creation and this feminine idea of water and birth. And then at the end of creation, we have the giver of breath, and man means earth. And it's an interplay, right, that in my opinion eradicates the modern language of human world versus the natural world.
And what do you say, Daniel, to the person who's like, oh man, this guy is just so poetic, and we just need to kind of dominate the earth and subjugate it under our feet so that it gives us the yield that we need. Forget all this nonsense. What do you say to a skeptic who has that kind of utilitarian or reductionist view of our relationship to the planet?
It's a really good question. That's a really good question. And it keeps me honest, and I thank you for it. Let me answer it this way. I think right now, we modern humans, we live in two stories, and you can pick which story you participate in. The first story is what I call a carbonic Messianic theology, or the Messianic theology of carbon, which is we live in these times of chaotic, jumbled messes of priorities where we reduce the great panoply, the great entirety of our problems, panoply of our problems down to this singular reductionistic linear view of, let's say, food or carbon or feeding the world. For this case, let me just say carbon. And then we do everything we can to deny that which denies the sequestering of carbon, or we do everything we can to deny that which doesn't produce excess amounts of food for the world. And we look at that action of denying that thing, right, as this, I'm the Messiah to the world. We're doing climate work. We're doing God's work. It's still keeping humans very central. And it's interesting, even there's a deep problem. Just Farmers Footprint, an amazing organization with Zach Bush, who I know you guys probably work with very closely. They just came out with this, and I'll let them provide the source. 33% of all conventional foods today are wasted in the distribution system. So if we grow 10 apples today, only 6.5, 7 apples will reach the market. And out of that, if we were to just solve for 25% of the 33% of food waste, so doing quick math, that's like what, 8, 9%? So if we were to cut food waste down by 8 or 9%, we could feed almost every developing country sufficiently with just 8% of the food waste. And so whenever I hear people talking about feeding the world and we have to increase production and carrying capacity of land, of vegetables and corn versus cattle, we have to realize that this is not a singularized system of inputs and outputs as if we're running some diesel engine, right? Like diesel engines are complicated systems. Diesel engines, or let's say combustion engines just in general, they have parts that can be reduced down and they're very complicated. But if you think about it, if you take a carburetor, let's say, out of an engine and you put it on a shelf at AutoZone, and you, Hilda, walk into AutoZone because you need a carburetor and you ask for one, they can give you one. It's not difficult. A carburetor is a carburetor in an engine or out of an engine, right? But as we get into the natural systems of Mother Earth, that which we belong, that which we are, we realize that as we pull a tree out of its environment, there is no AutoZone shelf to put it on. And if there was, if you walked into that AutoZone shelf and asked for, let's say, a black locust tree, because that's what sits outside of my window as I podcast with you here, what is a black locust tree sitting on an AutoZone shelf? It's not the same thing as sitting in front of me here in Central Virginia overlooking the James River. Its identity, its being, its is aspects of its life, it's changed. It's totally different. And so when we see the world from this very first view, which we call the Carbonic Messianic Theology, we have misrepresented diversity with a singular problem. We've reduced the entire complexities and beauties and love and everything else of this world down to a singular source, which can only produce negative aspects.
It reminds me of, what if I had that same utilitarian view with my spouse? And I was like, right. I give you food, you give me shelter. It wouldn't be a very healthy relationship, and it wouldn't last very long, probably.
Right, exactly. What you're saying is there's something infinitely deeper to the truth and beauty of your relationship to your spouse, or our relationship with ourselves, which is Mother Earth, and every other relationship that resides in that whole, which is this understanding of holism. This is why we are a hub with the Savory Institute. This is why we follow Alan. This is the essence of what holism and holistic management is about. If we don't operate within that paradigm, we can't operate within a system of abundance. And so the first myth, this first story, if you will, cannot produce abundance. And no matter the intentions, no matter the desires, the visions, we can't find abundance through control, linearization, and reductionism. Because nature can't be reduced. She is complex. She is not complicated. The second story, which I call the damsel in distress mythology, it's that nature is this damsel in distress who is perfect in her own way, but all she needs is her Prince Charming to ride on this Disney Channel infused white horse, right? We come in, we save the day, and instead of reducing the great panoply of problems down, what we say is humanity alone can save the earth. We are at our pivotal point where we can reduce greenhouse gas, we can sequester carbon, etc. But that also places us into a modality of control. I can regenerate the earth. Like I was just podcasting a couple months ago with Gabe Brown, one of the thought leaders and founders, if you can say, of the modern regenerative movement. And this was the conversation. You can do all of these things that regenerative agriculture talks about. You can jump on the horse. You can gallop with your sword ablaze through this king's forest of ancient English oaks, right? I'm just visioning a Disney Channel movie. And you can ride to the damsel in distress and you can save her. You can do all of these things. But you can do all of these things through controlling, through colonization, through enslavement, through all of these other truly, truly unholistic, unethical, immoral, unjust, use your perfect word, avenues, right? And we see this through this, like, if you just think about it from a regenerative agricultural practice perspective, like think about cover crops. So like, for instance, I might want to, maybe I'm managing 1,000 acres of corn, soy, and wheat in a monoculture environment, and it's through the essence of control. Maybe I'm managing 1,000 acres of grass, perennial grass species through cattle. And that's my goal. However you attack this thing, whatever background you come at it, we reach the same result if we were to both go out and buy 1,000 acres of cover crops, right? If you were to go out and you just go buy life, you would go to a Western Oregon, probably Washington state-based monoculture of white clover or field pea or annual rye or winter wheat, pick your cover crop. And you would buy, hey, I need 10,000 pounds, right? And we buy it, we ship it over via a 2-day FedEx air package. It arrives, we plant it, it grows, and we say, wow, look at us. We are regenerative farms, right?
Yeah.
And I think we, and especially the consumer, and I bring that up, there's a little bit of technicalities from the agriculture side, which I realize not all agriculturalists, but I bring it up for the consumer because we as the consumer believe that just because it's regenerative or labeled regenerative, that it is. But also when we hear cover crops, I think of a beautifully diverse meadowland with bees and butterflies and birds and happy cows and all these other things. But that's not where it's grown. If you can go online and buy 10,000 pounds of white clover seeds, it is not harvested in a 1 million acre gorgeous rolling hilled meadowland full of bees and hundreds of different species. And there's not like these little white clover fairies going around picking the seeds out of it. No. This is a linear, reductionistic monocrop of white clover grown in a chemically infused cornfield. It just happens to be white clover that's growing. And that's what I mean by we can regenerate our place. We can do regeneration here through the colonization of many thousand acres over there. And as long as it's over there and our eyes can't see it, our hearts don't know it. And we can continue pushing these ideas of regeneration forward without coming into a reality, an acceptance, a vision of reality that says, unless we all rise, we don't rise. That unless we all become regenerative, right? It's not just my land that matters. Like, this is not to sound like a rambling fool here, but just to continue real briefly, this is why I really dislike fence line photos. In the farming world, you see all of these fence line photos, right? Like, look at my lace. So you take a picture looking down your fence line. Let's say your neighbor's field is on your left, your field is on your right. And you say, wow, look at me. Look at the regeneration of regenerative agriculture. And look at the degeneration of conventional agriculture. And don't get me wrong, it is a beautiful A and B. It's a beautiful concept of the success and the lack of success of both of these systems. However, if you truly believe that the human body is healthy if its liver is not, you have a misinformed idea of health. And if you believe that your fields are healthy when your neighbors are not, although they share the same aquifer, they share the same climate, they share the same hydrologic cycle, they share the same social human community, the same mice that go from there come into my fields, right? The same snakes that predate on that mice, the same ticks and spiders and birds and bees and mammals and possums and skunks and everything else. They come from that landscape.
Right.
And so how can I have a regenerative field if I'm saying that mine is regenerative and theirs are not, if they are right next to us? So the idea, I can continue on, but the idea is here, regeneration requires the eradication of these two stories of control, the Carbonic, Messianic theology, where as long as we just fight that which fights this singular metric, we're fine. The damsel in distress, meaning that we are swords ablaze, riding on the white horse, humanity is going to save the world. And we have to change our language. We're not saving the damsel in distress. We are the damsel in distress. The solutions aren't outside of us. We are the solutions. We are not supposed to have a better relationship with the earth. You are the relationship. You are it. She is you. And so when it comes down to wilding, because that was your original question, like our farm, it's called Timshel Wildland. It's 400 acres. It's an entirely different place. What we're trying to question, not find answers for, not resolve. It's impossible. There's so much work more that needs to be done. We're trying to question, what does it look like in a highly productive agricultural system, right? We produce a lot of beef, a lot of pork, a lot of chickens, a lot of fruits and nuts, and we are a quote unquote farm. But we call ourselves a wildland because we're not interested in flying in 10,000 pounds of white clover seed in a FedEx 2-day air package from Oregon. We're not interested in controlling breeding. We run herd of cattle. Nobody's ever castrated. Nobody's ever separated. Nobody's ever weaned. Moms get to decide when they wean their babies. Boys get to be boys. The systems, and if I can say, the world is in place here. And so it's a little bit slower. It's a little bit harder. It presents many challenges. But the question is, just to restate it very simply, what does it mean for humans to be the relationship, to be the harmony, while still being able to produce enough food to be alive in the modern world?
And that's an amazing question. And I'm so pleased that you're asking it. I think we need to ask more questions and not see ourselves, as you said, in that archetype of hero riding in on the white horse. Otherwise, it's very much like the conventional system and that we're dominating and subjugating it in simply a different way. But I want to ask you, because you were saying, Daniel, something about the consumer. I know a lot of our listeners live in cities. They're not agriculturalists, more consumers. The question is, how can they start to understand these concepts of relating differently to the earth as opposed to just buying the food with the right label?
I think the power of the modern human being, regardless if they live in rural, urban, downtown New York City type urban, suburban, whatever, no matter where you live, if you're a human being listening to this, I think this applies to you. We have to start to begin, okay? And don't feel distress, don't feel pressure. We have to begin the return into localism. And what that means is you don't have to start growing a porch garden in your condo, although that's a great option. Maybe you want to start there, do that. We have to start returning into our local community and asking, what is being produced here? And if you're in downtown New York City, maybe that here is a little bit bigger than it is in a rural community. right? Because you might have to extend a little bit farther. But I know of an organization, it's a collective of, I think there's about 100, maybe 75 to 100 different farms that are all within an hour's driving distance of New York City. And they're just right there. And they actually deliver to downtown New York City. And it's a collective of regenerative farms. My point is, even if you're in the most concentrated city center in the United States, there are still farmers just in the periphery. And so what we advise is this, and this is very simple. Look at your feet, start there, and find the most local farm possible. Do not ask if they're regenerative. Do not ask if they care about nutrient density. Do not ask if they run polyface designed chicken tractors. Don't ask them anything. Okay? Don't ask if it's grass-fed and finished beef. I'm not even asking you to buy their products. I'm not even asking that. Walk to their farm, drive to their farm if you have to, take a subway to their farm, a bus, whatever it is. Find that most local farm. Again, it does not need to be a regenerative farm. In fact, it's almost better if it's not. And ask, how can I help? Because if my health actually, in scientific reality, depends upon you, and my nourishment, which might be the foundation of that health, right, depends upon your ability to produce it. And if you don't produce my food, even though I might buy from a better farm that's on the opposite side of the continent, I can't be as healthy as I need to be, as I could be, as I should be. Don't ask any of their practices. Just ask, how can I help? Maybe they need $500. Maybe they need you to help them pull some weeds. Maybe they say, hey, listen, I don't need any help. I just need you to start buying my products. The average farm in the Mid-Atlantic makes $18,000 a year. They work 87 hours a week farming and 37 hours a week marketing.
Oh, that's incredible. That's shocking.
It's shocking.
Yeah.
That's pre-mortgage, that's pre-tax, that's just cash flow, right? That's just revenue, top line. And so, yeah, maybe it means that you start buying their food. I'm not even starting there. To repeat, walk, find, bus, train, tram, whatever, subway to the most local farm. Don't ask them about their products. Don't ask them about their practices, and just ask, how can we help? Because if localism is going to win, it's going to win when consumers turn inwards. When good-minded, heartfelt, nutrient-desiring health nuts of consumers turn to the local farm and say, hey, how can we help? Because in our, putting my Robinia Institute hat back on, we manage, like I said, many tens of thousands of acres of farmland. And I have never met a farmer who farms locally that doesn't have the desire to do it well. They might just have never had the finances to do it well, the help to do it well, the knowledge to do it well. Maybe they just need to go to a $500 weekend course because they've never understood how to rotationally graze their landscape. The solutions are simple and small because they're local. So go to the local farm and ask how to help. That's what we advise.
Well, that is beautiful. And now you've given me a great idea for the mini-sode. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about your health because I'm sure folks will want to know the rest of the story, but our time on this full interview is coming to a close. I want to pose to you, Daniel, the question I always like to pose at the end here. If the listener could just do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
If you're a listener and you're a consumer, you buy these products, do what I just described. Start caring about local farms, start helping, start asking those questions. Don't do anything else but ask those questions. If you're a farmer listening to this or someone around the agricultural landscape, I believe that the thing that we can do to fix this problem is the eradication of this rugged and siloed individuality of farms. I'm telling the consumer, find your local farm. That's true. We as farmers need to start collectives, collaboratives, working together. We have to build synergies and symbiosis and communities. We have to stop being, this is my farm, it's amazing, it's better than everybody else's. That is just as degenerative as degenerative agricultural practices. We have to start working together and in this collaboration and hyper-collectivity, or even some people have described it as the de-individualization of local food, right? However you want to phrase it, start there.
Beautiful words to end on, Daniel. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely, Hilda. Hey, I'm more blessed than you could imagine to share the space. Thank you.
Our guest today was Daniel Griffith. You can visit his website, danielfirthgriffith.com, to learn more. And I'm Hilda Labrada-Gore, the host and producer of the Wise Traditions podcast for the Weston A. Price Foundation. You can find me at holistichilda.com. And for the transcript for this podcast episode, visit our website, westonaprice.org, and click on the podcast page. And now for a recent podcast review. Gisela says this: "Thank you. I love listening to your podcast. I love all the different subjects you bring in and the different professionals that you interview. I also love how easily digestible all the information is. And more than anything, I really love and appreciate your energy. I look forward to every week's episode. Thank you for all you do. Gisela, it is my pleasure. Thank you so much for your review. If you would like to leave us a review, just go to Apple Podcasts, click on ratings and reviews, give us as many stars as you like, and tell the world why the show is worth listening to. And thank you in advance. Also, thank you just for listening. Stay well, my friend, and remember to keep your feet on the ground and your face to the sun.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.